Hello, friends. Welcome to the Work Item Podcast. And every week we're bringing you new, excellent guests. And today I have Kirupa Chinnathambi, a web developer, writer, content creator, blogger, author. I don't know. What did I miss? Did I miss anything?
Oh, I mean, a product manager. That's probably my
A product manager.
One.
The most important part we missed. So a product manager as well at Google at that. So good to have you here.
Great to be here, Dan.
Well, I'm excited to learn about your career because of anyone in the web space. I know that you have a pretty remarkable one. You know, we've known each other for how many years now?
I think we met in person at least, was it 2012, 2013 maybe?
A long time
online,
ago.
A lot longer before then.
So it's been a while for sure. And I'm excited to see that you have made quite a few jumps in the meantime and landed at Google now. But why don't we talk about kind of the origin stories of what helped you get to where you are today? Like what started your interest in web development, web design? Because you've maintained your website, which by the way, very, very memorable, kirupa.com. That's it. That's the address. I remember reading it a long time ago when I was in college and I was like, whoa, this is some good web design right there. So what bootstrapped your interest?
It's all very accidental in so many ways. I always enjoyed drawing and designing and art. That was what I always enjoyed. And I also enjoyed writing, from essentially school and activities from that, it's like, how do I combine art and drawing together? And it actually was very funny because it was actually an assignment in my AP physics class in school so many years ago. And there was an assignment where we had to essentially write a paper describing 5 or 6 different scientific experiments and describe all these things. And it required diagrams, and I had no idea how to create these diagrams. So I was like, okay, what do I do here? I can write the words down. Microsoft Word was great for that. For diagramming, I needed something better than a typical graphic design tool. And I've been playing with Flash for a very long time. I always enjoyed Flash to create animations and do some of these side things with it to explain how I'm doing stuff. But I realized it was a perfect tool for drawing straight lines, drawing curves to show the movement of various physical objects, and then also have some labels and things that were drawn there. And I used the pixel font because that's the best font that printed at the right resolution, because I had no idea what DPIs meant and so on. So I'm like, I want this 800 by 600, maybe 1024 by 768 screen, and I'm printing to something, and I'm like, all the other fonts are blurry, whereas the pixel font was not blurry at all. And so I did my assignment and I threw that, and it got really, the teacher really liked it, showed it off to all the students in the class. And so I'm like, wait, this actually is interesting that people really like this kind of thing. And that kind of was probably the starting point of me exploring how can I start explaining things using illustrations and words together, which wasn't new by any means at the time, but the internet was just happening to start taking off. Content creation was just becoming a thing. GeoCities had just launched probably maybe 6-7 months ago, and you had less than a megabyte of space, and you had drag and drop files into it to make it all work. And the browsers happened to have free web editors that came with it. Netscape had Netscape Composer, Internet Explorer had Front Page Express. And so all these things kind of combined and came together at roughly around the same time, where I just happened to have the interest and access to all these tools, which then made it a little easier to try things out. And that's really what got me started in web development specifically, but also in terms of just getting an appreciation for writing code, explaining things, and simplifying complicated topics, which led to me doing computer science in college and product management, which is almost in many ways the umbrella of all the hobbies that I have, where everything I do feeds in some form or another into my career as a product manager.
So it sounds like it started very organically from trying to solve a problem, right? Like you were not learning it for the sake of, oh, I'm just going to learn this because there's a career in it. It's just more of you had a specific task that you wanted to cover. You found the tool to do that, and then just so happened to kind of stumble into oh, this is actually really cool. You can explain things easier visually and combine that with writing.
Exactly. It was funny that all my hobbies in some ways collided into creating what would ultimately become both what I did in colleges as formal education and also what ended up becoming a career for now.
In this case, when you think about your career, looking back to all these kind of incidental kind of stumbling over the technology, what do you think was the most important pivotal moment where you decided that, you know what, this is what I want to build my career around? Because we all have hobbies, we all have things that we enjoy, but oftentimes people are on the fence about, well, should I actually make a career out of this?
It's one of those things where it wasn't me proactively seeking out product management as a career. It's mostly me just bombing all my interviews for software engineering, development jobs instead. So the only door left open was actually product management, because I did not think that I could make a career out of my hobby of writing, doing animations and writing little programming snippets and explaining on my blog. It was always a side project, always something I really enjoyed doing, but it was not something I could see myself doing as a full-time thing, especially not in the mid 2000s or so, like 2007, 2008, as like a career opportunity there. But luckily, I did not do very well on any of my programming interviews in college. And Microsoft was interviewing on campus, and they wanted me to just chat. I mean, I applied for it, so they were like, "Yeah, come on and chat with us to see if you'd be a good fit." And I was doing a product management. It was called program management at the time, but it was mostly a product manager role, as it would be today. And they were very interested in essentially my side projects, my hobbies, how they get started, why they do these things, and all that work. And that was really what incentivized them to be like, you know what, I want you to fly into Seattle or, the Redmond campus to meet with the team and actually do more of this kind of thing and explain like why you'd be a good fit for this. And that's really what got me interested, or not interested, but what got me in the door into technology and also product management, because I had no idea really what product management really was. You always heard about it. I always liked reading biographies and books about, events, and technology was one of the things I always enjoyed reading about. So you always hear about product management. You hear about Microsoft was one of the first to have it. And then when Expedia spun out, Expedia was also like carrying that idea forward and so on. But it wasn't a very common, well understood term. So I'm like, okay, what am I getting myself into? But it's better than not having anything to do over the summer as an internship. So I was like, let me go ahead and do this. But once I got into it though, I really found like it was a combination of everything I really enjoyed doing. I enjoyed talking to people, I enjoyed solving technical problems, I enjoyed the idea of taking complicated things and simplifying them into things that would be understandable to different individuals, whether it is at a high level for like an exec meeting or at the very level of the details for someone who's going to be implementing things. And that was like a very natural fit for me. And I pretty much fell in love with product management at that time. And then I realized my hobbies now reinforce my career, and in some ways vice versa as well. Like what I did at work ended up influencing a great deal of what I ended up doing outside of work as well.
I find it somewhat funny that our paths are in a way very similar, in that I was also in the product management field because I was very intimidated by the software engineering interviews. And at the time, we're talking like decade ago, if you think about the software engineering interview, you're thinking about a lot of very hard, kind of tricky algorithm questions. And I don't feel that I was really good at those at the time. And I was worried that I'm just not going to get a job if I'm going to go for software engineering. I love engineering. I love writing code. I love tinkering. I've been writing C# for I don't know how long now. But the software engineering interview was the thing that actually convinced me. Is like, you know what? I don't want to interview for SE. I'll go for product management.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot can be said about how effective are software development interviews, especially today when just memorizing lead code and similar things for like, a few months will pretty much get you in the door as a software engineer at whatever company you could probably imagine. And does it really result in higher quality output from people? I don't think so. But it is what it is, in many ways. We're going to say the same thing about product management interviews as well. Like our day-to-day jobs are not quite as grandiose or as elaborate as the kind of questions that we ask people to do, especially when sometimes, if it's a journalist interview process, you're going to be asked about things that you probably have no passion about. And that very clearly shows.
Well, I'm actually glad that we moved away from the model where we used to ask people like puzzle questions, if you remember. Like, well, how many golf balls it takes to fill up a Boeing 747? Right? Like, well, it kind of, I guess, shows the way you think, but it doesn't necessarily translate to anything practical out of it. Like, okay, like, how to fill up an airplane with golf balls. Great. When you transition kind of to product management, was there any, I want to call it like a career culture shock of like, did not expect that certain things are the way they are, that you thought from the outside? Like, what were those for you?
It was very interesting. The team I joined was called Expression. They were building design tools.
Oh, yeah.
Adobe. And a lot of the leadership there was ex Macromedia and ex Adobe. And I'd been very familiar with the Macromedia ecosystem from having done work with the Flash tutorials and things for a long time. And so I knew the culture there in some ways from talking to people there. And so that, I think, minimized a lot of the shock that I normally would have felt, because whenever I compared notes with a lot of my friends who also joined Microsoft around the same time, and they were more traditional Microsoft orgs, it was very different, their descriptions of what their day-to-day job was like, even as a product manager, versus what mine was, because the kind of individuals I had, my first managers, were all ex Macromedia and very design tool centric, and they were new to Microsoft as well. So they brought with them their own cultures from the at that time, like Macromedia was a small company, so or medium sized company, and then other companies were much smaller, and that gave it a very different feel. You're in a larger Microsoft bubble of like large corporation has its own ways of doing things, but within that you had your own microcosm where you were kind of like insulated from what was traditionally Microsoft. You're moving really fast and you're doing a lot of things, and that really gave me an appreciation for product management from I would have never imagined in like a large organization in the way it was. It wasn't until I decided to switch roles and go to a different part of Microsoft when I first saw the rough edges of like how product management in a large company, how it is done, and how it probably could be done differently and better. But it was a lot of like, first, it's like the 7 stages of grief or whatever. You're like, wait, why is it taking so long? Then you accept it, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to try to, change things up a bit. Let's see how we can go faster and how we can speed things up, taking what I learned at my early years at Microsoft instead. And that was a lot of fun, in many ways, trying to fight against the culture in some ways, but also agree that some things cannot be changed. It's just how the company is going to operate, accepting, that this will not change.
How do you find that balance between what you can fight against and what you just have to accept? Because I feel like this is a fairly common situation, especially for folks that are new to a team coming out of college or from another job. You kind of get airdropped into a specific, culture in an organization that is kind of seems to be set in stone. And then you kind of start seeing the rough edges and you start seeing things like maybe this can work a little differently. Maybe this could be tweaked. For you, what was that bar that kind of established like, okay, I can change this versus these are the things that are set in stone and I will just grind myself instead of me actually fixing this?
I think it's a little bit of, obliviousness combined with arrogance. I think those are the two things I'd mentioned. I'd say because I had a lot of like ideas of what works and doesn't work, both from my early years at Microsoft, having seen how products can be shipped, how we can have some impact in the market very quickly. And also with my side project with Kirupa.com, where I was able to kind of, figure out ways of like scaling technology, scaling basically a one-person thing that I was doing to be able to serve like that many people via the forums and all these things. I had like some intuition that I built up through like trial and error, where I felt like these are things that are going to be successful. And having a track record in some ways helps, because I came into these teams having some reputation for having done things that were interesting in the past at Microsoft itself, and so there's a little bit of like extra rope they gave me to try some of these things out. And I had great managers as well who were very supportive of a lot of this. I'd say like, if your manager is not supportive of you doing these kind of things, it doesn't matter how effective you are at like being able to convince other people about it. Your time on being able to do that would be very, very limited. So I think it was just like so many things, Dan. It's right place, right time, and the right people to kind of allow you to do some of these things. And once people start seeing success from those efforts, that company changes their mindset as well. It's like, okay, we're going to let this person go and on their own and do these things. And we know that this person will probably have a greater chance of succeeding than crashing and burning the entire team as part of doing so. And as long as the team is happy, that matters. That saw a lot of things as well. So I think it was like, my management saw that the team was effective and they were not complaining that Kirupa is going, too far off the deep end and how Microsoft is done. And I think those kind of things kind of helped. Whether that was sustainable or not, I have no idea. I was young at the time. So for me, these were all just fun things to do.
It's interesting that you're alluding to two things that are often missed when people talk about career advice. And this podcast is about careers. And two key things is luck and a good manager. And the good manager part is often underappreciated. And then the fact that your manager is the gatekeeper to so many things, opportunities, projects, impact. If your manager doesn't want you to succeed and they're not investing in you to succeed, you will not succeed in that particular team and company. And the second one is luck. And that is sometimes you just land on a team that does not have impactful projects or does not have projects that are visible. And it's experience that with time will help you kind of assess that and seeing like, well, that's not the right fit.
Exactly. And I think those are parts that are always very hard to control because you can never really determine what kind of a manager you're going to be getting. When you're interviewing for companies, it's always a bit of a leap of faith you're taking that, on average, every company has their style, their persona that they're very well known for. Amazon has a style, Microsoft has a style, Google has a style. And so you're kind of getting in with the idea of like, okay, it's a high probability the manager I'm going to be having will probably fit any of these various molds that have been determined. But of course, all large companies are many, many small companies within them. So within that, just like I was able to, I'm going to say luck out by having a very good set of team from ex Macromedia, ex Adobe when I first joined Microsoft the first time. It gave me a very different culture of what product management really should be like and end up becoming. It's very different than what someone else would have had joining Microsoft at the same time because there are different ways there. And that's where the luck part comes in. But I think a certain part of it also just has to do with your own personality as well. I'm not going to say that I have the skills to work with very difficult people on a day in, day out basis, but I think that maybe I might be more agreeable or more amenable to changing my style to suit the style of someone like my manager who I'm working with, who might be very different than another manager I might have had. And I think those also kind of play a role as well. Like your own personality also, helps. If you're completely inflexible in changing your working style, adapting to how another person might expect, what success and failure and progress looks like, those kind of things also are something you can control to increase your chances of getting lucky.
What I find fascinating about what you just said is increasing your chances of getting lucky. That's not an obvious thing to do. How do you increase your chances of getting lucky? And I'd say like from the work that you've done, probably looking at your blog, the books you've written, the content you create, a lot of this I'm sure kind of opens doors and opportunities as we talked about. But what's your recipe for increasing the likelihood that you will get lucky?
Doing whatever you can that's all within your control to being able to increase that. I'd say the number one thing, especially for product managers, is be very good at what you do. If you can become a domain expert in whatever area you're being a product manager in, by all means, go for that opportunity and continue to work on that because that helps build credibility. It also helps really build intuition. I made a career out of working with developers and developer tools and frameworks and that particular area. And I really enjoy that space because I'm also passionately curious about that area itself. So even if Microsoft or, like I owned Salesforce later on, or now I'm working at Google, all these very similar things, even if they weren't going to pay me to work on all these fun developer products and things, I would be doing it on my own anyway because I enjoy that area a lot. And that gives me an advantage because it helps me to see around corners, helps me see where the future is going to go. And so when people come in with like requests or here's customer feedback, I'm able to put it in the context of where I think the long-term strategy for the product needs to be, where the company should be going with regards to some of these things. And being very good at what your domain is, that can make up for a lot of defects and shortcomings you might have as a product manager in other areas. Because the idea often is that we want to create well-rounded product managers where you have people who can do whatever however many number of scales that they have in like strategy, insight, execution, and all these other things. The idea is that the perfect product manager, a great product manager, is one who has like a high bar across all of them. The reality is that just like how we found out that unstable systems, or what makes airplanes fly and rockets go into space, it's not, none of the forces are balanced. It's the perfect imbalancing of all these things that makes things work really well. I started to believe over the years that in many ways, product managers, just given how few of them there are in a typical organization, have to be that very unstable force to kind of, hopefully balance out the team and make sure if the team is going in one direction, that the product manager bounces in another direction. But the product manager individually is capable of being able to have a level of instability that causes them to be more effective than the average product manager you might find there. And so I think, and being very good at your job at least being very good at the domain you're working in, is one of the first levers you can control. Everything else is going to be contextual based on the like, let's say the culture of the company you're in. If you're in a company that's very top-down driven, you need to learn to become very good at how do I parse, information from my management? How do I translate the things that are meaningful to my engineering team? If the company's very bottoms up, how do you make sure that you're still executing quickly, but not letting the teams wander off and start doing things that have no chance of being successful at any point in the future? And so a little bit of that is just you being able to read the tea leaves and making sure you're not completely oblivious to the things going on around you, and you're only focusing on your domain expertise.
I think this is the first time I've heard a product manager being described as a force of instability. And in this context, it makes a lot of sense because you kind of have to become the Jack and Jill of all trades, and being able to push and pull when necessary and do a lot of these things that are breaking the norms of, oh, we've always done it this way. No, but is this the right thing for the customer? Is this the right thing for the product? What you mentioned about being really good at what you do, I think is also one of the pieces of advice that is often undersold, and that folks think that you see a good product manager, you see a good engineer, and the default kind of bias goes towards, oh, they are just very talented, right? And talent is this hand-wavy thing that like, oh, they're born with it. They were really good at this. But oftentimes, what I'm hearing from you, that can be developed, right? Because if you're really good at what you do, be it a product manager, a designer, a web engineer, these are acquirable skills. Like, this is not out of the realm of being able to become good at it, right?
Exactly. The example I like to use, I don't know if you play video games, but
yeah.
I know you play video games.
You know me. I
know you play video games.
We talked about Halo on your podcast.
Yes, exactly, right? I think of like a lot of this as like a role-playing game in so many ways. When your character is created, you get to choose some basic classes, of like, you're going to be a warrior, you're going to be a mage doing magical things. And when you do that, certain skills by default are given extra points, and other skills are ones you can choose to develop as the game goes on. So, because all of us are very different and our environments and what we encounter and things shape so much of our skills in areas, by default, some people are just going to be better at product management on day zero. They might just have been, doing more debate classes in school. They might have had more opportunities to do more independent projects and things like that. But that doesn't mean that someone who focused on very different skills, worked on, focused on like the very analytical and mathematics and like, a software engineering path sometimes, for example, right? It does not mean that maybe on day zero, there might be a mismatch, an imbalance in skills and abilities. But all the skills are teachable and learnable. It might take more effort for someone who wasn't, exposed to product management like activities growing up to become a good product manager, just like it would take a lifetime for me to become a good software engineer, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that you just need to invest the time and do the hard work, which oftentimes is overlooked when it comes to, when you look at, like you mentioned, when you look at product managers or great developers or great architects and just like, or marketing individuals or great developer relations, all the various disciplines that we run into on a given basis, they make it look easy because they put in the hours and they've done all the things that need to be, tried and failed and iterated on to get to that stage that they're in. And so I think there's maybe there's like a handful of people in the world who is born natural product managers. And, just like in video games, you can choose a character that is so imbalanced that it just starts off, with like no ability to carry any armor because it has no strength, but it can like, do magical things like, on day zero, on, the first few minutes of the game that most players have to wait like, the mid part of the game to get to.
Out of those things, what's important to also call out is the fact that we see the outcomes often. Like we see at people that are successful, and we think like, wow, they're doing really amazing job. Like I look at your blog and be like, Kirupa, man, do you have like a lot of visibility and like clout with the community? You have your own forum, man. But it took you how many years to get there?
Yeah, I've been doing that formally since 1997. I say formally, that's when the domain was registered. Before it was a long GeoCities domain URL instead. But yeah, it's been a long time of me doing this. And I would say that my investment in that has always like, fluctuated, depending on how busy I'm at work or my personal life and things like, I have a daughter, for example. So I like to spend time with her, and that takes time away from all these other side projects that I typically do. But it's it's the consistency of it. I still spend at least, a few minutes every day going through and like, okay, if I had to write this topic, how would I describe it in an easier way? Because, I call it a career reinforcing hobby at this point. Before I used to balance both my blogging and side projects with my work as like two independent activities. But now I have my day job, and I like to it's like, my respectable day job versus my degenerate side projects. It's like I use my side project as a way of reinforcing the things I do in my day job, which oftentimes really is very writing heavy, which is often very complicated in terms of like, how do you take abstract information and very quickly turn it into something concrete that can be communicated at the right level to whoever your stakeholders are at any given point in time. And that, just like anything else, is just practice. And so and that's why I kind of, wrote a book on data structures and algorithms, like about a year ago, partly because I'm like, I've been writing about front end development and things forever. I hated that subject in college. That was the reason I couldn't get a job as a software engineer in any of my interviews. Let me figure out how can I, take all the things I've learned about how do you learn things very quickly, how do you distill it down to meaningful, simple steps. Let me take that topic because it's brand new to me and see how I can simplify those things into things that can be taught to more beginner, developers or even like students in some ways, because that directly has a throughput to how I do effectively in my job, where I'm often thrown into random situations where I don't have full context, but I need to basically represent my team and my manager and be able to do a good job here. So those are the things I'm trying to artificially now find ways of reinforcing some of these skills. And that was one example where I wrote a book on a topic that I dreaded, hated, and I didn't want to do.
Career reinforcing hobby. So when you think about your blog, the things to write, the content to create, does it usually go through the lens of how will this benefit my career in the future? Or is it more just kind of tying to the work that you're doing today in your day job?
It's a combination of, am I having fun and do I enjoy what I'm doing right now? So I'm not going to talk about, for example, gardening. And I'm not going to talk about that because, I can definitely explain complicated things. I can learn about it, simplify it down and do it, but I'm not passionate about that particular area. And, you often see advice like, do not make a career out of what you're passionate about. And I fully agree with that. I just got lucky in so many ways in that what I am passionate about, which is developers and developer tools and frameworks, just happened to be an area that saw massive growth and interest and investment over the past 20 years. If I picked something completely, like unrelated in that area, it'll be a very different conversation. You and I probably wouldn't even be talking basically, but, this goes back to luck and timing again, where it's hard to predict what 10 years from now, what the economy would look like, what parts of the tech industry would be really valuable. But it just so happened that the early days of developer tooling, design tooling, and frameworks and all of these things just happened to catch interest where more than just Autodesk and Adobe and maybe Borland were investing in that space heavily. And then, all the companies are now investing in like, how do you make developers more productive, either internally or externally? And so I rode the wave of that in some ways. So that helped. And because I still care about the space, it was driven by my passion in that space, not because I saw a career opportunity, that kind of balanced itself out. And so I would say that it's a general purpose piece of advice. Pick what you're doing today that is going to be relevant for you as your current job and make that part of your hobby. Unless you really don't like what you're doing right now. And you want to, let's say like 5 years from now, you want to do, let's say I want to become a lawyer. I want to join the legal profession. How can I use technology and my interest in that to influence that particular world? I might make my hobby something that I can plan for the future as opposed to something right now. So it all depends on, are you content in the area, your problem space you're working in right now? Or do you want to change it? If you want to change it, make sure your hobby, reflects. It's kind of like going to the gym, at some point. If I'm going to be, let's say I want to be a world-class archer, I'm probably not going to be doing like, swimming exercises all day. I might be focusing more on the kind of activities I might want to do to become better at archery, maybe shoulders and back and arms and things like that. And that's the way I look at these hobbies. You don't go to run a marathon without training for it. You shouldn't go to any, as a PM, you shouldn't go to any like presentation or write a PRD on a new topic without having some preparation, on the side as well. And so it kind of uses gym and training example, and different people have different, variations of it, because I use my day job as the primary key, and then everything else, supports it. But I know some people who have their day job just be a secondary thing and have their primary job be what we would call a side project, and then use all the information from their day job to influence that. So it's in some cases not a career reinforcing hobby, it's a hobby reinforcing career. And there's no right or wrong way here. You just got to pick which part of this equation you want to optimize for and just run with it. You don't want to waffle, just never waffle.
I've heard stories in the past where people would, for example, run into issues with their day job where they have a hard time convincing somebody of a project or a technical decision or architecture, and it's that like unbreakable wall. You just cannot get through it because people are just like arguing with you, and then it's like, you know what, I'm going to write a blog post about this and put it into the public view. Obviously you're not talking about anything like confidential or anything like that, but blog post, and then blog post makes it to like Hacker News. You see all the discussions, and you go to your engineering team and say, see what the community thinks. So you use that as leverage. Do you ever find yourself using your artifacts that you've created through your blog or your books as something to help you and kind of reinforce your authority in your career?
No, I've never done that. I'm very careful to not do that as well, because my view is that because I'm using that as a way of reinforcing my ability to be effective at my job, if I'm having to kind of cross the state lines and explain like, oh, by the way, here's how you do it over here, I've failed. And so my goal is to kind of like, how do I contextualize all the knowledge I have in my side projects into it's relevant for this audience without ever having to point them to like, prior material that I have created. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but I think it's just a personal style. Yeah, so it goes back into just my own style of how I think I'd effectively operate. Because it's not scalable, right? Because one of the things that as I become a PM and been there for a long time is, how do I create a thing that lives beyond just my ability to be here? And if I were to point to people and say like, oh, look at what I blogged and did that, that breaks the system down, because that's not a repeatable process where another product manager can't come in and basically do the same thing. Because if a team gets used to operating where the authority of one person is what determines whether something is done or not, when that person leaves, we always use the example of like, what if you get hit by a bus? How will the team survive, right? If I get hit by a bus, how will this process repeat itself? And so I'm always very, very careful to make sure that anything that I'm doing or any kind of situation where we need to, have a alignment between different voices, that the process used for doing that is one that can be generalized and applied by anybody, provided they put in the time and effort, but not something that requires only a single individual's unique, skills. It's a combination of luck and hard work. That should not be the basis of what gets done.
It's interesting that these kind of things are often perceived as career moats, right? Like if you're the one person that knows everything, well, they can't fire you. You know everything. You're critical to the team. But oftentimes that's also a very much a career limiting move because of how critical you are to what you're doing, and you're not sharing the insights, you're not sharing the knowledge, and there's kind of the bus factor comes into play. And then he's like, nope, can't get this person out of this role, because if we do, we lose all this institutional knowledge.
Exactly. But as we've been seeing from the economy, in the tech industry specifically over the past, like several, I'm going to say past year or so, as it turns out, you can actually get rid of those people, and the company and the team are actually just fine,
Yeah, if there's one thing that we've learned is that nobody's irreplaceable. That's for sure.
Exactly, right. And and now you're trying to figure out like, how do I race ahead of ChatGPT and Gemini and all these other AI assistants to make sure that they don't end up like replacing us wholesale.
I don't know. I feel like there's large swaths of PM responsibilities that I can totally see once ChatGPT becomes better and better and better. Like, it becomes much more effective at it. And I can totally see that things changing, and people need to prepare for that change.
Exactly.
In terms of balancing everything that you're doing, so you do a lot of things. I've alluded to from the very beginning of this podcast. How do you find the time? What's your recipe for doing a great job at your primary career and also writing on the blog, maintaining a forum, writing books, making videos, being on this podcast, and all these things?
Yeah, it goes back into, if I list the 5 or 6 activities that go into what does it take to write an article, write a video, reply to questions on the forums, and then balance it with like what I do as part of my day job in so many ways, the things I've been doing, the diversity of things I've been doing has not changed. So I just became really effective at doing the 5 or 6 things for almost 20 plus years at this point now, where in 30 minutes, it's about how much time I put per day onto all these activities. I'm able to get an article mostly finished, really get a newsletter post mostly done, and then I repurpose that content in multiple ways. Almost all my videos are based on the content I've already written earlier. Because I have a heavy emphasis on using visuals to illustrate what I'm writing about, the slides in many ways are already created. I already have the artwork I created for the article. And so my goal is to repurpose as much of it as I can. So that way I'm not really trying to do too many things at once. There might be there's a Venn diagram. It's not two circles like on two different sides of the screen. It's like, it's a big overlap with some things that are more specific that only my job will be relevant for. Other things that my hobby will be relevant for. But it's a big overlap that allows me to not duplicate and do wasted work. And I think that's really the key, because it also goes back to, again, what I talk about, what I write about, and what I work on at my professional job in some ways. There's a large level of overlap, especially with web developers. What I work on right now is I work on a web-based developer environment, for running browser-based code and things like that. Web developers are a big part of that audience, and app developers and mobile developers, big part of that audience we're trying to target. And so how do you solve problems for them? It means that I need to understand deeply what those developers tend to run into as issues. And it just so happens I care about that space a lot. And so me writing about things is one of the easiest ways I found to articulate what is a valuable thing and not a valuable thing. And so, in general, I think being good at writing is a good skill for everyone to have. But I think the most important thing that writing does is it helps clarify what matters and what doesn't matter very effectively, without having to go through the many iterations of telling someone and then having them be confused or puzzled, or them pointing out flaws in your logic. Because when you're trying to teach someone something about this area, that's when you start to see like, okay, this is meaningless. Why am I even explaining this? This is no point. And that is a learning which would have otherwise been very difficult to get outside of you having actually done this on your own.
And incremental progress, what you just said about like 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there. People think that you just need to sit down and write everything in one go, and you really don't. You can just do little incremental bits here and there, and it all accrues to a bigger project in the long run. Because little bits, like, I'll tell you this, like, I don't know about you, but my calendar gets booked up very fast, and oftentimes it's hard to find like a 4-hour block to just sit down and write code or write a whole blog post. But if you write like 30 minutes today, 30 minutes tomorrow, by the end of the week, you might have 2 or 3 blog posts right there.
Exactly. The thing is, like, my output has definitely decreased significantly compared to what it was, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. Like, I can see, like, before I used to do like a blog post a day almost, and it was just like natural. But now it's like maybe a blog post once every few weeks. But it's complemented by like, a few short videos on LinkedIn, then a couple of videos on Twitter, and then eventually that gets put to a newsletter. And so the aggregate output is still very similar, but the types of output that I've traditionally done has changed greatly.
This is wonderful. Well, I want to wrap up this show on asking something that I ask of everybody on the podcast, and that is, if you think of an unconventional piece of advice that you would tell somebody listening to this from you personally, what would that be?
I think it goes back into the being a great force of instability. What I always tell people is that you're always like, it's a very fine line between getting promoted and getting fired. And if you're somewhere that middle, where you're not in either of those camps, you're not doing your job effectively, especially as a product manager. This is not literal. Like, not every product manager should be doing this. Like, there are many roles in product management where not everybody in the company can basically go and try to change things up. There are certain roles as a product manager, though, where if you're working on a new product, if your job is to improve the process in the team and make some of these things work, you have the agency to go and try to do things differently, because that's what you've been asked to do. And if in those situations, definitely try to not do what everyone else is doing, because in many ways, just like startups, just like smaller companies, where if everyone is doing something in one direction, your chance of success increase greatly if you're doing something different. Otherwise, you're going to be competing for very small amounts of whatever resources are going to be distributed. And so disrupting is a huge part of like why we see NVIDIA having done really well in the last 10 years compared to other companies that did similar things. Or if you look at AI specifically, no one predicted 2 or 3 years ago that we're going to be in a world where you can chat to an agent or talk to an agent, or even just, describe something visually, and then have some level of information back that is more than just a search. Those are things that no one anticipated. But it required someone out there to think about going like, I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to tie this, really large model with something else. For example, with transformers. Google created a transformers paper. They did not use it beyond the academic areas, or they had it internally, but it wasn't really publicized. It took someone else to kind of I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to ignore the naysayers and the critics. I'm going to do something very different. I look at careers in many ways as that as well, because if you want to be successful in your career, and you're making that your primary key, not your hobby reinforcing career, but a career reinforcing hobby, and doing side projects to help your career be better, try to find ways where you can be different and try to improve things that are broken, because those are things that people are always know is a problem. No one has any idea how to fix it. And if you can come in and be the person and highlight, maybe there are ways we can do this better, do it faster, do it more effectively. Those are the things that often require unconventional ways of thinking and getting things done, which may benefit you more greatly in the long run than just towing the party line.
It's all about the long game, right? As you're talking about your analogy of the whole role-playing game, if you're building a mage character, make sure that the skills kind of accrue as you play the game, and you're not staying at the same level a year later.
Exactly. You can do a new game plus. You can always change companies, change your scope, and do something you were doing earlier. And that's also something. It's actually pretty fun to do as well in some ways.
Kirupa, so folks can find you on kirupa.com, and we'll make sure to include links in the show notes as well. So if folks want to go and check out your social media and your writing and the books, they can go there. Where else can they go to learn about the things that you're building, the things that you're working on?
That's pretty much it. The links to all the stuff is somewhere at the bottom of the footer. You can see my other social media links and things like that. But, whatever happens, hopefully the domain name kirupa.com will still point to me and not some, landing page for a domain squatter, so.
Sounds great. Kirupa, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Dan. It was a blast.